Hi! Today we're going to be talking about the cell structure. And right here's an example of one of our cells that we're going to be talking about. So to start off with, I want you to think of cells as the building blocks of everything living, because that's what they are. A good way to think of how small cells are and how something so small could make up some of the biggest organisms, such as trees or even us, is to think of a beach. So this is an aerial view of the beach, and right here is a close-up view. So we know that beaches are made of all these tiny little grains of sand. Well, looking at this aerial view, you just see one solid mass of yellow or tan, and that's kind of how cells are. You don't see the tiny little grains, you just see your arm or a tree or a dog. You don't think that they could be made up of something so small. So that's similar to cells. And right here is a picture of a slide of skeletal muscle cells. And each one of these little boxes is a cell. And you can't see those with the naked eye, but we know that these make up things like our arm muscles. Today, we're specifically going to be talking about eukaryotic cells. Now, we'll discuss later the difference between eukaryotic and prokaryotic cells, but today I want you to focus on the U, and the U stands for do, and this means that these types of cells have membrane-bound organelles, and these are just the things that make up and provide all living kind of everything that the cell needs to live is done within the cell. So that's eukaryotic. And the DNA for a eukaryotic cell is found in the nucleus, where prokaryotic, it's more free-floating. So we'll talk about that later. Eukaryotic cells make up plants, fungi, protists, and animals. And yes, we're included in animals. To help you better understand cells, today I'm going to give you the definition, but we're going to focus on a comparison of cells, and our cell comparison today is going to be of a cell restaurant, if you will. So we'll get into that. The first characteristic or organelle that we'll be discussing is the cell membrane. The cell membrane is actually this right here, all this white clear looking, and it holds together the cell. It's actually the whole outside of the cell. Now the cell membrane is responsible for what comes in and out of the cell through these little channels, and that means that it is semi-permeable. And it helps the cell maintain homeostasis. And homeostasis is just the regulation of what's in the cell and what's outside of the cell, and what keeps the cell stable and able to live. Now, in our cell restaurant, the cell membrane is the door. Maybe the front door, the back door, any of the doors, because it allows a barrier between the inside and the outside, and it also is semi-permeable. Maybe think of how the back door to the back of the restaurant may only allow workers to come through, whereas the front door only allows customers. Or you could even think of how it's selective to what times you can come in, whether the restaurant is open or not. So that's how our restaurant is semi-permeable, just like this eukaryotic cell. The next is the cytoplasm. And the cytoplasm is kind of all this yellow, and you can't tell by the picture, but cytoplasm is actually really jelly. And it is this gelatinous area that contains other organelles. And it's just where all these other things, like the mitochondria here and the lysosomes, take part in their activities and what they're made to do. In our restaurant, the cytoplasm is our dining room. So it's kind of like the tables and chairs and everything that's around where these organelles, such as waitresses or cooks, partake in their jobs and what they're made to do. You could also think of the cytoplasm in a restaurant as maybe that yummy smell when you walk in, because it just surrounds everything that's going on or everybody is doing their thing. That's kind of how you want to think of cytoplasm in a restaurant. Now the next is our cytoskeleton, and it's kind of hard to see, but back here you can see some little lines, and up here you see some lines, and these are part of our cytoskeleton. Now the cytoskeleton in our cell gives the cell structure and organization. It kind of, because all this cytoplasm is jelly and we just have this little cell membrane holding it all together, we need these pieces of cytoskeleton to kind of keep it this round shape, because if not, it would just flop around like goo or something. And in our restaurant, our cytoskeleton are things like wood, bricks, cement, nails, anything that makes up the walls and the outside of our restaurant. So it's the main structure of the building, if you will. Now we're going to talk about ribosomes, and if I had big red flashing lights, I'd use them right here, guys. Ribosomes. These are all these tiny little dots. You see them here on this blue stuff, the endoplasmic reticulum, and you see them over here on the nucleus and free floating, and they're going out of the cell, and they're just doing everything. So, looks like it's a pretty big deal just looking at the picture and all these red dots. Well, it is. Ribosomes actually, they code for DNA, and DNA make up what the cell will become or what it will be told to do. Ribosomes also make proteins, and that is just a huge deal for these cells because it helps them undergo their life processes. And in our restaurant, the ribosomes are actually the recipes because they make up the food. So we'll think of ribosomes as recipes and food as the proteins because that's what they end up making up. Now, we'll go to the endoplasmic reticulum. Now, the endoplasmic reticulum is all this blue, all this up here, all this around. Everything that's surrounding the nucleus here is our endoplasmic reticulum. And this is where proteins and lipids and other components of the cell are assembled. Now, the rough ER, if you look here, these are both part of the endoplasmic reticulum. The rough ER is called the rough ER because it looks rough because all these ribosomes are in it and stuck to it and amongst it. The rough ER produces proteins and helps transport these proteins because the ribosomes, again, produce them. The rough ER transports, and they leave by kind of getting pinched off to the Golgi apparatus, and that's the green stuff, is the Golgi apparatus. The smooth ER has no ribosomes, so that's why we call it smooth, because it's up here and doesn't have any of those little bumps. And smooth ER is responsible for detoxifying things, and I don't know if anybody's gotten to see any pictures of one or anything, but the liver in actually organisms is smooth like this smooth ER. And that is because its main purpose is to detoxify. So that's kind of neat that the cells have their own little liver here is kind of how it is. And in our restaurant, the endoplasmic reticulum resembles the kitchen and the counters where the food is assembled, and the rough ER assembles the proteins just as these cooks assemble food. It's kind of like the line that they pass it down and get it ready to send out. We could think of the rough ER as maybe the main assembling, and then if you've ever seen pictures of cooks or watched cooking shows where they wipe off the edges of the plate and kind of make it look good and clean, we can think of that as a smooth ER because it detoxifies, so this plate looks nice and clean and no toxins, if you think of it that way. And that's our smooth ER. Now, the nucleus, and that's this big honking thing in the middle. It's pink and purple. The nucleus is the control center of the cell, and it holds the genetic material inside. That's the DNA. It's inside the nucleus, and that's what tells our cell what its function is going to be, what it's going to do. And the DNA in our eukaryotic cells are held inside the nucleus, where in prokaryotic there isn't a nucleus, so it's just kind of free floating. So that's one of the differences there. And the nucleus has this little nucleolus inside of it, and it's this kind of spiky looking ball in here, this dark purple, and that's where ribosomes are produced. And then they go out these little channels, and that's why all these ribosomes are on the outside of the nucleus here, and then it's conveniently right next to this endoplasmic reticulum where all of them are held. So that's their little function there, and that's how they get out here. The nucleus of our restaurant is the boss, because in particular here, she would tell the cooks what to do or how the waitresses do what they do, and she would regulate and control her restaurant. And that's what the nucleus does for our cell. Then we could also think of this guy here actually is our nucleolus. So maybe she's first in command and he's second. And he, if we think back to our ribosomes, again, are the recipes that produce our proteins. So the head chef here would produce our ribosomes just as the nucleolus would, so that he partakes in the cell function and it all starts with him. Now next we're going to talk about our mitochondria, and that's these big jelly bean looking things with this membrane in here, and we'll discuss this double membrane at some other point, but just so you know, these are the mitochondria. There's even one back here. The mitochondria are the powerhouse of the cell, and just as our restaurant would be the power, the electricity that comes in, and it could be the outlets, the lights, etc., for the kitchen equipment maybe. And the powerhouse of the cell actually takes glucose, which is kind of like sugar, and oxygen to make ATP. We'll go further in depth in this process, but for now, you just need to know that the mitochondria takes glucose and oxygen to form ATP for the power of our cell. And it's kind of seen as food for the cell as well. Now the Golgi apparatus, that is this green stuff right here. And the Golgi apparatus is responsible for packing these proteins that are sent through the rough ER to it. And they actually contain enzymes that modify and send them out. And you can see the little vacuoles here that they're actually pinching off and sending all of these proteins out of the cell. And materials. It doesn't just have to be that. And in our restaurant, these are our waiters and waitresses, because they determine where to send these foods, the proteins that the cooks make and that the ribosomes are code for, and they send them to the tables they need to go to. Now, the lysosomes, and that's these little white guys. This one actually even has stuff in him, so that's pretty cool. Focus on him. The lysosomes in our cell are the waste bins. They just kind of remove everything that's unwanted of the cell, and they're kind of like a trash bin in a restaurant or the dumpster. Now, centrosomes. Centrosomes are essential for cell division, and they can't produce, cells cannot reproduce without centrosomes. And again, we'll go further in depth of cell reproduction, but here's just an introduction to where all these things are so you guys get a good idea of it. And centrosomes are kind of like these little churro looking things with these spicules coming out of them. And they, in our restaurant, are kind of like ingredients, because without ingredients, you can't have food, you can't have proteins, you can't have everything else, because centrosomes are essential to have eukaryotic cells, because they are essential for the reproduction and continuation of them. And ingredients are essential for food production in our restaurant. So they're kind of like things that you may not think of being so important, but they really, really are. So, that was our cell structure, and more specifically eukaryotic cell. And we'll talk further in depth on all this later. Bye!